A week from today, a state funeral service will be held for President Jimmy Carter at the Washington National Cathedral. The former president died on Sunday at the age of 100, the first American president to be a centenarian. He left behind a legacy of service from decades after he left the White House, starting with his and Rosalind Carter's creation of the Carter Center, which helped cure diseases in Africa, monitored elections around the world, built also more than 4,000 homes as part of Habitat for Humanity, which has served millions of people overseas since it began in Americus, Georgia, near Plains. Back in 2019, I spoke with President Carter about his commitment to Habitat. Even after a fall that left him with 14 stitches and a black eye, he was out building homes.
Everyone is wondering, how did you have the resilience and the strength, and why, to be showing up for Habitat after falling and injuring yourself? You got 14 stitches.
Well, I always put Habitat first, and when I possibly can. We haven't missed a Habitat project in 36 years, so I didn't want to miss this one. This has been special for us.
And joining me now is Jonathan Reckford, the CEO of Habitat for Humanity, who we saw at that building site with the former president, the late president. Jonathan, first, my condolences. I know you worked so closely with both of the Carters. And now, of course, we have lost Jimmy Carter after losing Rosalind last fall. But when we were talking in 2019, you said that President Carter and his wife, Rosalind, would, quote, literally put Habitat on the map. Tell us how that changed the lives of millions of people.
Well, it's hard to separate President Carter from Habitat for Humanity. I think it's the first thing people think of when they hear Habitat. And most people think President Carter started and ran Habitat, which is actually not true. But what is true is in 1984, Habitat was a tiny organization, and when President and Mrs. Carter rode up to New York City with a busload of volunteers and slept in a church basement and rehabbed a tenement building on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, that's when the world found out about Habitat. And I think that started that extraordinary 36-year run that President Carter talked about of building somewhere in the world every year, and seeing a former president of the United States personally out there serving alongside these families and building the homes, I think inspired so many people. So as you mentioned, directly, those Carter projects helped 4,447 people have the chance to purchase new homes. But that really only scratches the surface of their impact, because in so many ways, with their leadership and inspiration, Habitat's been able to help over 62 million people have new or improved housing. And I think that sustained commitment and heart and direct hands-on engagement of the Carters was such a big part of that.
And his service was so important in so many different ways, you know, curing guinea worm and river blindness in Africa, what he did in overseeing elections. But it was seeing a former president of the United States hands-on with a tool, you know, tools around his waist, and seeing the First Lady wielding the hammer. He was a skilled craftsman, did a lot of wood carving at home as well in Plains. But it's just, it was such a special image of service.
Absolutely. And, you know, it was actually for the first many years, it was the Jimmy Carter Work Project. And then we, when we were building across the Gulf Coast in response to Hurricane Katrina, we renamed it the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter Work Project, appropriately honoring the fact that they are the only two that participated in every single one of those builds. And Mrs. Carter was another hero and such an incredible servant leader as well. But I do think it reflected so much their faith, their service ethic. President Carter often talked about how working with Habitat was the best way he knew to put his faith into action in a very tangible and practical way. And he also talked about our increasingly divided, socioeconomically divided world, and that it created a vehicle for creating community and building bridges across that socioeconomic divide. And he would always say he got more out of it than anything he was able to put into it. I hear that from many volunteers. I might respectfully disagree in his case because he put an awful lot in and had such an impact. But I do think their personal humility and their love would just shine through. There's actually a lovely story even about that very first build where all the volunteers were sleeping in a church basement, and one couple had given up their honeymoon to come on the trip. And the Carters had had a Sunday school classroom set aside so they'd have a little privacy. And they gave up the classroom for that couple and then slept out on the floor with everyone else. And I think that just sums up so much of who they are.
I just want to share one anecdote that I'm sure you know of. The New York Times has a story about the Carters' commitment. There's the anecdote from former Habitat worker David Snell, who said to the Times, Mr. Carter strode up to him early one morning, asked, "Who's in charge of providing the toilet paper?" Mr. Snell replied he guessed he was. "There's not enough of it," Mr. Carter told him, and walked away. That will be familiar to a lot of people who work for Jimmy Carter in the White House, because he was a detail man, indeed.
He was, and we would always go over the plans ahead of time. We would do a tour of the site before the build would start, and then midweek we'd actually go around and visit every home to make sure they were on schedule. And he would actually reallocate folks and pull some ringers off some houses to make sure other houses could catch up. But he cared deeply about the quality. And he would say all the time, "Look, this is not a photo op. We're here to work." And you could see you did not want to slack off if you were working on his house.
Well, Jonathan Reckford, thanks to you and all the Habitat volunteers, including my own brother.